My son smiled when the judge read the final number. Not a proud smile. Not the kind a man smiles when he's earned something. It was the smile of someone who had already decided the outcome before walking through the door. He leaned over and whispered something to his attorney, and both of them chuckled quietly, the way men chuckle when they believe the game is already over. I sat on the other side of the room and said nothing. My name is Gerald Hooper. I'm 64 years old. I spent 28 years in the United States Army before I retired, and I know what it looks like when a man underestimates his opponent. My son had been doing it his entire life. He just never knew it. The hearing was supposed to be straightforward. My father, Robert Hooper, had passed away 4 months earlier, at the age of 87. He'd built a modest but meaningful life in Greenville, South Carolina. A small hardware business, a piece of land outside town, some savings he'd quietly accumulated over decades of careful living. Nothing that would make headlines. Everything that represented a man's entire life's work. My brother, Douglas, sat beside me. He was 61, 2 years younger, recently retired from a career in insurance. We had driven down together from different cities and barely spoken the whole trip. The silence between us wasn't hostile. It was the kind that grows between two people who've spent years on opposite sides of someone else's choices. Our sons were also present. My son, Carter, was 38. He worked in commercial real estate and wore suits that cost more than most people's rent. Douglas's son, Marcus, sat quietly near the back. He was 35, worked as a physical therapist, and looked like he'd rather be anywhere else on earth. I noticed the judge before the hearing officially began. He was reviewing paperwork at the bench, reading carefully, adjusting his glasses every few minutes. He looked to be somewhere in his late 60s, experienced. The kind of judge who had seen enough courtrooms to stop being impressed by anything. Then he looked up. His eyes moved across the room in the routine way a judge's eyes move before a hearing. They passed over the attorneys. Over Douglas. Over Carter. Then they landed on me. He stopped. Not a long stop. A fraction of a second. But I noticed it because I had spent nearly 3 decades training myself to notice exactly those kinds of pauses. The pause a man makes when something doesn't match what he expected. The judge returned to his paperwork. The hearing began. But something had shifted. I could feel it, though I couldn't yet explain why. To understand what happened next, I need to go back. I grew up in a small house on the east side of Greenville. My father was a quiet man who worked long hours and rarely raised his voice. My mother taught elementary school for 31 years. Douglas and I shared a bedroom until I left for basic training at 19. We weren't wealthy, but we weren't wanting either. My father believed in paying cash, living within your means, and never asking anyone for anything you couldn't earn yourself. He also believed, without ever saying it directly, that Douglas was the son who would stay. I don't blame him for that now. I understand it better than I ever did when I was young. I was restless in a way that small towns don't easily absorb. I wanted to see something beyond the county line. The Army made sense to me from the first time I heard a recruiter speak at my high school. Something about the structure, the discipline, the idea of serving something larger than your own ambitions. It clicked in a way that nothing else had. I enlisted the spring after I graduated. My father shook my hand at the bus station and said 2 words. "Be safe," my mother cried. Douglas stood beside them, looking genuinely confused, like he'd just watched me choose to walk into a storm he couldn't see any reason to enter. I was gone for most of the next 28 years. Not entirely. There were holidays, short leaves, the occasional week here and there, but the Army takes hold of a man's life in ways that are hard to explain to someone who hasn't lived it. Deployments, reassignments, training rotations. The calendar becomes something that belongs to the institution more than to yourself. I didn't resent it. I had chosen it. But I understood, somewhere in my 40s, that my absence had shaped my family's opinion of me in ways I hadn't fully accounted for. Douglas stayed. He built a life 3 blocks from my parents' house. He was at every birthday, every Thanksgiving, every hospital visit. When my father's eyesight began to fail in his late 70s, Douglas drove him to appointments. When my mother passed in 2019, it was Douglas who handled everything while I flew in 2 days before the funeral and left 3 days after. I don't say this to excuse myself. I say it to be honest. By the time my father died, I had been retired for 6 years. I had moved to Asheville, bought a small house with a good porch, and spent my days gardening, reading, and trying to figure out what a man does with himself after 30 years of being told exactly what to do. I visited my father more in those 6 years than I had in the previous 2 decades combined. We had found something in those years, a quiet comfort between us that we'd never quite located when I was younger. He never said much. Neither did I, but we'd sit on his back porch in the evenings and watch the light change, and that felt like enough. When he passed, I grieved in the private way men of my generation tend to grieve. Not loudly, but genuinely. The estate hearing had been scheduled for a Thursday morning in March. I arrived early, dressed plainly, and sat down without speaking to anyone except Douglas, briefly, in the hallway. Our relationship had been polite and distant for years, not because of any specific argument. Because of all the small, unspoken ones that accumulate over time when two brothers have made entirely different choices. Carter arrived 20 minutes later with his attorney, a man in his 40s who carried a leather briefcase and smiled the smile of someone accustomed to winning rooms. Carter greeted Douglas warmly. He nodded at me the way you nod at someone in an elevator. Polite, impersonal, a performance of courtesy. The hearing began. The documents were reviewed. The assets were listed. My father's hardware store had been sold several years ago, but the proceeds were held in a trust. The land outside town was still intact. The savings accounts. The small investment portfolio my father had built slowly over decades. Then came the proposed distribution. Carter's attorney spoke clearly and without hesitation. The arrangement, as he described it, directed the substantial majority of my father's estate to Douglas and his line. My share, as the attorney phrased it with careful legal neutrality, was minimal, symbolic. The kind of number that tells a man he has been included just enough to prevent a challenge. I sat with my hands folded on the table and said nothing. Carter didn't even look at me. He was reviewing something on his phone. Douglas looked uncomfortable. He didn't meet my eyes, but I noticed his jaw tighten. Whether that was guilt or something else, I couldn't say. The judge reviewed the documents in silence for nearly 2 minutes. Everyone waited. Then he looked up again. And this time, he looked directly at me, with an expression I recognized immediately from my years in the service. It was the expression of a man trying to place a face. He studied me for a moment, then spoke. "Mr. Hooper," he said. "Gerald Hooper." "Yes, Your Honor." He paused. Then he asked quietly, almost to himself, "Did you serve?" The room went still. "Yes, Your Honor. 28 years, Army." He leaned forward slightly. "What branch?" "What years?" I told him. "Infantry. Then a long stretch in Special Operations Support and Logistics. Retired as a Master Sergeant in 2018. The judge removed his glasses. He set them on the bench and looked at me with an expression that had nothing to do with probate law. He said, "I need a moment." Carter looked at his attorney. His attorney looked at the judge. Neither of them said anything. The judge opened a folder on the side of his bench. He flipped through several pages. Then he stopped. His hand went flat on the document. He looked up slowly. The expression on his face had changed completely. "I need to tell you something," he said to the room. Something I would normally consider disclosing before a hearing of this nature. But I was not aware of it until this moment. Carter's attorney straightened in his chair. "Your Honor, if there's a conflict of interest." "There may be," the judge said, his voice steady and quiet. "But before I decide how to proceed, I am going to say what I have to say, because some things matter more than procedure." The room was silent. He looked at me. "Do you remember a vehicle accident on Interstate 26 outside Columbia, November 2016? The question hit me before I fully understood it. I said, "Yes, Your Honor." What followed was something I had not spoken about publicly since the day it happened, November 2016. I was driving back to Fort Jackson from a weekend in Asheville. It was late afternoon, overcast, the kind of flat gray sky that flattens everything beneath it. I was on a long stretch of interstate just past the Lexington exit when I came over a rise and saw it. A minivan had crossed the median. It had rolled twice and come to rest on the driver's side in the left lane, blocking most of the road. A pickup truck had rear-ended it at highway speed and spun to a stop on the shoulder. Traffic was beginning to pile up behind me. I pulled over before I had consciously decided to. The minivan was the priority. I could see movement inside. The windshield was cracked through but mostly intact. The driver's door was inaccessible. I went to the passenger side, which was now facing upward like a hatch. I don't remember making a lot of decisions in the next several minutes. Mostly I remember the weight of the door, the smell of gasoline and something metallic, a child's shoe sitting alone on the pavement a few feet away. There were 3 people in that vehicle. A woman in her mid-40s, unconscious but breathing. A teenage girl in the back, dazed, with a cut above her eye that was bleeding badly. And in the far rear, a boy, maybe 11 or 12, who was pinned and not responding. I worked on the boy first because his airway was compromised. 30 years of combat lifesaver training and watching medics work in conditions worse than this meant I knew what to do even when my hands were shaking. I cleared his airway. I kept him still. I talked to him even when he couldn't respond, because that's what you do. You give a person something to hold on to. By the time emergency responders arrived, I had gotten all 3 of them out of the vehicle. The boy had a serious spinal concern and 2 broken ribs. The woman had a concussion and a fractured wrist. The teenage girl had a laceration that looked dramatic but wasn't life-threatening. I gave a statement to the responding officer. I drove to Fort Jackson. I filed it away in the part of my memory where soldiers file things they'd rather not keep in the front. I never learned what happened to the family afterward. The Army kept me busy that winter. And then came another assignment, another year. You do what you can in the moment. Then you move forward. There's no other way to operate. Back in the courtroom, the judge's voice was steady but different now. That woman was my sister, he said. The room didn't gasp the way rooms do in movies. It went very, very quiet. The specific quiet of people recalibrating everything they thought they understood. The judge continued. Her son spent 11 days in intensive care. He has 2 pins in his spine and walks with a slight gait to this day. But he walks. He graduated from Clemson 2 years ago. He called me last spring to tell me he'd been accepted to medical school. He paused. The doctors told us that whoever stabilized him at the scene prevented a cord injury that would have paralyzed him permanently. Possibly worse. I looked at the surface of the table. I didn't know it was you, the judge said, until you told me your unit and your years of service. My sister described the man who helped her family. She described the way he talked to her son. The things he said. She kept a copy of the responding officer's report with your name on it. He folded his hands. I have read that name every Veterans Day for 9 years. Carter was no longer looking at his phone. The judge addressed the room. I want to be transparent that this creates a situation I need to evaluate carefully. I will make that determination in a moment. But first, he looked at my son, then at Douglas, then back at me. There is something this room needs to understand before we go any further. He looked at Carter's attorney. When was this proposed distribution prepared? The attorney shifted. Several months ago, Your Honor. And who initiated the arrangement? A pause. The judge waited. The arrangement, the attorney said carefully, was developed in consultation with the elder Mr. Hooper's son, Carter Hooper, following extensive discussions with the family. The judge looked at Douglas. Were you present for those discussions? Douglas looked at his hands, some of them. The judge nodded slowly. And you, he said, looking at me, were you consulted at any point during the preparation of this estate distribution? I looked at Carter. No, Your Honor, I was not. The judge removed his glasses again and set them aside. He said, I think we need to look more carefully at several things. I had not come to that courtroom looking for justice. That sounds like something a person says to sound noble, so let me be more honest. I had not expected justice. Those are different things. I had spent enough years watching institutions function to know that good outcomes require evidence and process, not moral clarity. I had walked in, resigned to the number they had assigned me and the humiliation attached to it. What I had not anticipated was a man who had spent 9 years reading my name. The judge recused himself from the estate determination, as he was required to do given the connection he had disclosed. He referred the case to a colleague, but before he stepped back, he did something that was not required of him. He asked the court reporter to read into the record a summary of what he had described. He said, quietly, that he believed the record should reflect who Gerald Hooper was, independent of whatever the estate documents said. Carter sat in rigid silence through all of it. I think about Carter a great deal, even now. More than is probably useful. He is not a simple person, and I don't think he set out to be cruel. But there is a particular kind of damage that happens to a child who is handed things too readily. He had grown up watching me be absent, and Douglas be present, and had concluded that this meant I was lesser, that my absence was a character defect rather than a commitment, that whatever I had done in those 28 years was, at most, distant and irrelevant. He had never asked me about any of it, not once. After the session was paused, Douglas came and sat beside me in the corridor. We hadn't sat beside each other voluntarily in years. He looked older in the fluorescent hallway light, tired in the particular way that comes from knowing you should have done something sooner. He said, "I didn't know about the accident. I know. I knew he hadn't been fairly treated," he said, meaning me. "I knew the distribution wasn't right. He stopped. I waited. "I didn't want the argument," he said finally. "I thought maybe you wouldn't fight it. I thought maybe you'd just let it go the way you let most things go." I looked at him for a long time. "That's not the same as it being right," I said. He nodded. "No, it isn't." We sat in silence for a while. Outside the courthouse window, a parking lot stretched out in the flat March light, ordinary and gray. Somewhere in that city, Douglas's son Marcus was probably on his way to a patient. Somewhere else, Carter was on the phone with his attorney. Douglas finally said, "I should have called you more. I thought about the long years, the holidays I'd missed, the ones I'd attended that felt like visiting a house where I'd never quite lived, the careful politeness of it all." "Yeah," I said. "You should have," he nodded. I know, that was all. It wasn't enough to undo anything. But it was more than we'd managed in the previous decade. The replacement judge reviewed the estate documents over the following 2 weeks. The investigation that followed was quieter than what I'd expected, more bureaucratic and less dramatic than anything you'd see on television. But it was thorough. Several transfers that had occurred during my father's final years, when his memory had become unreliable and his signature had become something Carter's attorney apparently found easy to obtain, were flagged for further review. I will not say what the final conclusions were about intent, because the legal process makes those determinations, not me. What I will say is that when the estate was finally settled, it looked considerably more like my grandfather's actual wishes than the document presented on that Thursday morning in March. I did not feel triumphant. I want to be clear about that, because it matters. I did not leave any of those hearings feeling like I had won something. I left them feeling like I had witnessed something very old finally being named. Something that had existed in my family for decades without ever being spoken directly. The belief that a man who leaves to serve is less of a man than one who stays to manage. My father had not been a cruel person. But he was a man of his era, and men of his era had particular ideas about proximity and loyalty. He loved Douglas in the visible way he loved things that were present, touchable, consistent. He loved me in the way you love something you don't fully understand. From a careful distance. I think he was proud of me. I think he simply never knew how to show it to someone who spent most of his life in a different time zone. I stayed in Greenville for an extra week after the final hearing. I drove out to my father's land one afternoon, the piece of property outside town that had been in our family since before I was born. 42 acres of red clay and pine trees and a dry creek that ran in the spring. I walked the property lines the way my father used to walk them on Sunday afternoons, slowly, without any particular destination. I found the corner marker he had set when I was about 7 years old, a rusted iron post with a small concrete collar at the base. I remembered watching him drive it into the ground with a hand maul, and thinking he was the strongest man on earth. I sat on the ground next to it for a while. The judge called me several weeks later, not in any official capacity, just as a person. He said he had wanted to reach out since the hearing but had waited until the proceedings were complete to ensure there was no appearance of impropriety. He asked how I was. I told him I was getting by. He said his nephew, the boy who had grown up to apply to medical school, had asked him to pass along something. He said, "He wants you to know that he thinks about the man who talked to him that day." He said he doesn't remember much of it, but he remembers a voice. He said it felt like someone had decided he was going to be okay before he knew it himself. I sat with that for a long time after the call ended. There is a version of my life where I drove past that overpass in November 2016 and told myself it wasn't my responsibility, where I decided that someone else would stop, where I kept driving toward the gate at Fort Jackson and filed the whole thing away under not my problem. A lot of people make that calculation and there is no shame in it. Emergencies belong to first responders. Strangers belong to each other. But the Army had spent 28 years teaching me something I couldn't unlearn. The person next to you is your responsibility, not because of paperwork, not because of assignment, because they are there, and you are there, and what happens next is the only thing that matters. I had applied that to a child I would never meet, on a gray afternoon in November, without any expectation of return. I had applied it to men in places I am not at liberty to name, over the course of nearly 3 decades. In conditions I rarely discuss. I had not applied it loudly or publicly. That was never the point. The point was simply that you show up. You do the work. You don't make speeches about it. Carter came to my house in Asheville 6 weeks after the estate was settled. He stood on my porch in a jacket that cost too much for the occasion and looked at me the way a person looks when they are genuinely unsure whether they deserve the door to open. I opened it. We sat at my kitchen table with coffee. He didn't bring his attorney. He didn't bring a prepared statement. He brought himself, which was the first time he had done that in as long as I could remember. He said, "I didn't know about the accident." "I know." He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "I don't think I knew very much about you at all." That was honest. More honest than I expected. I asked him, "What did you think you knew?" He thought about it. He said, "I thought you were someone who left and didn't come back. I thought you were someone who put the Army ahead of everything else. I thought—" He stopped, started again. "I thought Grandpa was disappointed in you and that his wishes reflected that." I looked at my coffee. "And now?" He looked at the window. Outside, my garden was just starting to come in. Tomatoes I had planted the week before. Herbs in a row along the south fence. Ordinary things. The quiet accumulation of a life after decades of noise. "Now I think I filled in a lot of blanks," he said, with what was convenient. That's something. Coming from Carter, that was a considerable something. I did not tell him everything was fine. It wasn't. I did not tell him we would simply return to normal, because there was no normal to return to. The relationship we had was always more about performance than substance, and now the performance had been dropped. What we could do, I told him, was start from what was true. He nodded. He seemed to understand that was the most I had to offer. Before he left, he stood at the door and said something that caught me off guard. He said, "The judge told people you didn't want to make a big thing of it, the accident. He said you seemed uncomfortable when he described it in court." I said, "That's accurate." He said, "Why?" I thought about it honestly. "Because I was doing what I was trained to do," I said. "You don't expect credit for operating according to your training. You just expect to do it right." Carter looked at me for a moment. Then he said, quietly, "I think I would have driven past." I don't know if that was an admission or a confession or simply the first honest thing he'd said in a courtroom full of dishonest ones. I don't know if he meant it as an apology or a statement of fact, but I understood it, and I think that's where we had to begin. The good we do quietly has a way of outlasting the noise made by those who underestimate us. Gerald never stopped to help that family on the highway expecting recognition. He simply did what his training and his character demanded. Years later, that same quiet decency walked back into the room at exactly the right moment. You never know which ordinary Tuesday holds the moment that changes everything. Keep showing up, keep doing the work. The right people are paying attention, even when you aren't. A small note to our viewers. This story was crafted and imagined by AI, created to bring you an engaging experience while carrying a message worth keeping close to your heart.